We're exploring the questions and the possibilities behind the NFL's most injured team in 2021. Joining me to discuss is Dr. Eric Friedman, a sports doctor from South Carolina. That's coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. My name's Patricia Traina. Happy Friday to everybody. We made it through another week, the first full week without any NFL football, and we're not going to see any meaningful NFL football until September. So we're going to do our best to fill the void while we wait for free agency and the draft and all that other good stuff to kick in. And want to first thank you, as always, for making the Locked On Giants podcast your first listen of the day, or if you're watching us on YouTube, your first watch of the day. And remember, Locked On Giants is available for free wherever you get your podcasts. So hope you are subscribed and that you are enjoying the shows that we have here for you. And on today's show, we are doing the long-awaited injury report. Now, what this show is going to be about is I was able to book a gentleman who is a sports medicine doctor, Dr. Eric Friedman, who came on the show. Dr. Friedman has worked with Duke University's football team. He is also part of the Charleston Sports Medicine Group, and I'll have information for you where you can find out more about Dr. Friedman in the show notes. And what we did was we talked about some of the injury issues that the Giants have had, some of the maybe theories behind it. You know, has it been the turf? Has it been something else? You know, how can they address it? How can they treat it? So we had a whole discussion about that, about a half-hour discussion, and that's going to come up in just a bit. But first, let me give you a little bit of background on the Giants injury situation. So I use two websites for Giants injury information. One is mangameslost.com, which is a subscription site. And the other one I went to was CBS Sports. And I'm going to give you some statistics to kind of set the stage for this discussion that I had with Dr. Friedman. So in 2021, the New York Giants, according to Man Games Lost, had 356 games missed by players. All right. So that includes, by the way, not only injuries, that also includes illness. COVID-19, the flu, whatever the case may be. That number, 356 games lost, was number one in the NFL. So the Giants were technically the most injured team, according to mangameslost.com. Now, CBS Sports has a listing of all the injured players according to team. And I went in and I took a look at that. And I'll put this link, by the way, in the show notes for you. But CBS Sports lists 28 players as questionable for the start of training camp. Now, there is a disclaimer here. Some of those players are UFAs who probably will not be on this team next year. But as of right now, the Giants, as of the end of the season, the 2021 season, have 28 players who, due to injury, are listed as questionable for the start of the 2022 season. So that's a big problem. All right. Now, let's go into some more numbers for you. From 2017 to 2020, the Giants finished in the top 10 in Man Games Lost. I think the lowest they were in that period was number 9, and obviously the highest was number 2. And I'm not counting 2021 when they were the most injured team, according to Man Games Lost. The last time you can argue that the Giants were healthy in terms of not being in the top 10 goes back to 2016, when they had 180 man games lost. That, by the way, was 19th in the NFL. That was also the first year of Aaron Wellman's tenure as strength and conditioning coach. And the average man games lost for the Giants between 2017 and 2021 has been 282. Now, when it comes to injuries, folks, a lot of times, it's not the number, it's who's getting injured. I firmly believe that. So, for example, the Giants in 2021 lost Danielle Jones. They had Andrew Thomas land on IR for 3 games. They lost Blake Martinez. That can somehow affect how a team comes through with the injury situation. But nonetheless, from a big picture perspective, the Giants have had an injury problem. And, some people think it's the turf. Some people think it's how they train. All kinds of different theories. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to come back with Dr. Eric Friedman. And I had a bunch of questions for him about the various factors that go into injuries, the turf, the training, supplements, stretching, weightlifting, whether freestyle weights is better than machines, so on and so forth. Just a whole big discussion. We also talked a little bit about Saquon Barkley and his comeback and what was going on there. So that will close out the rest of the show, that being my interview with Dr. Friedman. So that is coming up right after this break. All right, Giant fans, more still to come on today's Locked On Giants podcast with Dr. Friedman. But first, football season might be over, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired head coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline.net is also the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season, whether it's basketball, hockey, boxing, and UFC. Plus, they have coverage of the Olympics. So head on over to the website today and on your mobile device or desktop to learn more about their trends and actions. Bet online, where the game starts. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I am Patricia Traina, and this is the long-awaited injury episode that I've been talking about that I promised you guys I would have for you. And I am pleased to welcome in Dr. Eric Friedman. He is a sports doctor, sports medicine doctor, and he is with Charleston Sports Medicine down in Charleston, South Carolina. And Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come on with me to answer some of these burning questions we have here in the land of the Giants.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right, Dr. Friedman, let's kick this off. The Giants have been one of the most injured teams in the NFL, not just last year, but over a period of time. And I have stats that I presented in the first segment of this podcast and that I'm going to put on the website as well. What is it about? Why are teams, so injured? I mean, it can't be a matter of luck. They all play on turf. They all play on grass. Obviously some teams play on different surfaces more often than others. But what is usually at the core of a team being so injured versus a team that's relatively healthy?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's a very multifactorial answer here. Obviously, if I had an exact answer, Mr. Mara would be paying me a lot of money, and I wouldn't be doing this. But anyway, so it's a little bit of everything. So I'd say the most thing is kind of philosophy of the team and who they sign and who they draft. So every team has a medical staff, and the Giants have a great one. And a lot of fans like to point to, oh, it's the team doc's fault. Oh, it's Ronnie Barnes, the head athletic trainer's fault, which is almost exclusively not the case. It's philosophy. So the Giants have had a philosophy, especially over the past few years, of signing a little bit older free agents, people like Golden Tate, Antoine Bethea, Kenny Galladay, even more recently, Kyle Rudolph coming off a Liz Frank injury. So it's mostly just philosophy of who you sign. And you might even think about players in college. Maybe a player's had a hamstring injury before. Well, there's a ton of data showing that if you've had a previous hamstring injury, that puts you at about a 6 times risk to have another one. Or things like concussions, if kind of similar data. If you've had a previous concussion, that this data is a little bit more variable, but around 6 times again, risk of another concussion. So obviously the medical staff informs the GM and the coach and everyone of this, and it's up to them to decide what type of risk are we willing to take for this player.
How much of this is training? Because I've always had a philosophy that, these guys hire trainers to work with them in the off season. And I question whether those trainers are equipped to teach them football related stuff versus just, how to look good. So how much does training factor into this?
That's a great point. I mean, especially with the Giants, they have Ronnie Barnes, probably the most respected athletic trainer and head of medical personnel in the league. So a lot of players exactly do go to kind of private gyms, and players are hot commodities at these private gyms, and they'll promise them and do a lot of things because, one, they get the publicity of having these players, and two, the players have usually a lot of money to spend. I've always been a big fan of kind of supervised. I know you guys briefly touched on this earlier in this week on one of your episodes, but the supervised training. One, it's best for the players because God forbid something does happen, it's all covered. And two, the supervised training, I mean, you have, like I said, the best in the business, Ronnie Barnes, and a lot of, you see all these posts on Instagram of these players doing these crazy training things that I agree are not football specific. I've also been a big fan of, you should train the way you play. So if you're not going to be having chains around your neck and hopping on kind of one foot, it's probably not going to be very helpful doing that really well in practice or in training. But most of the trainers trainers and medical staff all talk throughout the league. So it's not a lack of knowledge or understanding of the data. It's a kind of, like I said, multifactorial.
Now, different training staffs have different ways or different philosophies when it comes to the weight room. Some of them believe in free weights. Some of them believe in the machines. Now, I am not a personal trainer. I know I've worked with personal trainers, and they have told me that if you really want to get the most out of your workout, you want to go with free weights. You don't want to rely too much on machines. Is that applicable also in terms of preventing injuries? Does that help, or does that maybe hurt by stressing out the joints and the ligaments and all that stuff?
Yeah, once again, not a ton of data on this, but I'm a big fan of free weights, kind of what I was touching on earlier. It provides more of those compound movements that you'll see on the actual football field, as opposed to kind of machines, which have a very regulated range of motion, which is not very lifelike when you're playing football.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely not. Now, football in general, it's a violent game. I mean, you put your body through things that I think one player once said that it was like going through 50 car crashes, a week, which is kind of stressful. But what outside of contact usually leaves the body more susceptible? And I'm talking in terms of diet, maybe nutrition, maybe rest, oxygen, all that stuff. Does that all factor in some way, shape, or form?
The answer is yes. Once again, it's a little bit of multifactorial, and I used to be one of the team docs over at Duke, and I know we focused a lot on kind of body mechanics and landing mechanics, and a lot of universities and professional teams kind of do the same. It could be something as easy as the way you land. Are you obviously the players are very strong, but are you actually activating your glutes when you land and working on them to really focus on that? The other thing is kind of when you're getting tired later in the game, are you now not activating your glutes? So kind of doing that in practice as well, saying, okay, we're going to practice this before, but then after you go through a full practice, sprints, everything like that, let's practice our landing mechanics again. So it's a little bit of everything. I know Julian Edelman kind of, when he tore his ACL in 2017, he's been quoted as kind of saying, well, my leg got it was a bad cut by me. My leg got too far outside of my body. And some athletes kind of blame themselves for things like that. And some of them, like you mentioned, no matter what, it's just bad luck. But sometimes it's kind of focusing on how you're cutting, the way you're cutting, and activating those muscles that you may not normally use.
And that, of course, ties into this theory about, are you more susceptible to have ACLs, for example, on turf as opposed to grass? Now, Saquon Barkley, when he tore his ACL, that was on a grass field. So that kind of, in a way, shattered that myth, if you will, that bad things happen only on turf. And speaking of Saquon Barkley, he underwent reconstructive ACL surgery, which I believe is different from repairing the ACL. Can you just explain a little bit about the difference in the procedures, and does one take a little bit longer to maybe come back from than the other?
Of course. Well, first I'll touch quickly on the turf thing. I know that's a hot topic. I know Deebo Samuel tweeted out kind of during the Super Bowl, we shouldn't be playing on turf fields. And actually there is a good data behind that. Turf definitely does have increased risk of ACL injuries, mostly because one of the things that protects ACL injuries is your foot slipping out. And with turf, with the stickier substance, you have better footing, but it doesn't slip out, causing increase of ACL injuries. But people who say, oh, well, grass is perfect, exactly like you said, obviously you can still have ACL injuries, and grass actually has increase in soft tissue injuries because of the slipping out more. You have more kind of muscle pulls. A lot of players would rather that, because instead of possibly missing the year, you may only miss a few games. But there is actually good data behind that, and saying that maybe we shouldn't be playing on turf fields. As far as the repair versus reconstruction on ACLs, almost every single athlete gets ACL reconstruction. So basically the difference is the repair would be if you basically just stitched the torn ACL back together. And that's been kind of proven in the literature to not hold as well. The reconstruction is most likely Saquon Barkley got a patellar tendon reconstruction. In other words, they took part of his patellar tendon and put it into his knee and made a new ACL with it. And that's what basically all the athletes are getting. Some non-athletes would get quad tendon or hamstring tendon, but most of the athletes get patellar tendon just because it holds a little bit better, and it is less loose. You can get a little bit of a tighter repair. I know a lot of people were, especially at the beginning of the year, were talking about Saquon and how he didn't look as fast, and I completely agreed with that. With ACL, I mean, we talk about the 9 to 12 month return, but that's returning to play. That's not necessarily returning to play at your previous level or 100%. And I think you could even see with Saquon Barkley, or Joe Burrow would be a great example. As the year went on, I thought Saquon Barkley looked a little bit faster, was cutting a little bit better. And Joe Burrow, I mean, he even said it himself. At the beginning of the year, he didn't feel like himself. And then at the end, he felt like his knee was kind of back to until he kind of had that MCL injury in the Super Bowl. But his ACL was near 100%. I actually tweeted back in September, I think it was week 2 versus the Redskins. The Giants posted a picture of Saquon in shorts warming up, and you can still see the quad atrophy. In other words, his one quad was still a lot smaller than the other. Now, granted, both of his quads are much bigger than 99% of human beings. But for him, you can even see the difference, and that's just by watching a video, not even looking closely. So it just takes time. No matter how hard you train yourself, it just takes time to rebuild those muscles and get them back.
Is it kind of like a rubber band? When you first take a rubber band out of the package, you got to stretch it a little bit to really optimize how far it'll stretch?
It's a little bit of that. It's more just not using that knee for a while and just having that atrophy of the muscles or breaking down of the muscles, and then just training your body to kind of trust the knee. There's a huge mental aspect of ACL injuries. Just kind of your knee doesn't feel exactly that. No matter how perfect the surgery is, your knee doesn't feel exactly the same, especially immediately after. So it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, and I think he also had a meniscus tear too as part of that injury too, which I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, that if you're going to get a knee injury, the meniscus is the one you want to have because that's the quickest one you can bounce back from.
I think I probably wouldn't say that necessarily. With the ACL, actually, what you want to hear after, if you're a player and have an ACL, is that it was just an isolated ACL injury. In other words, there's no meniscus tear, there's no MCL tear. Once you add that meniscus, it actually, the data shows that it's going to take a little bit longer for you to get back to 100%. So that kind of all goes with why it took Saquon a little bit longer this year to kind of start feeling himself.
See, I always thought that the meniscus was the easy of the two, where if you just shave it off, it's fine. I speak from experience on that too.
Yeah.
So now, preventing knee injuries, a lot of people say, well, can athletes do something, wear a brace or do something like that? And we do see some athletes with those knee injuries, especially interior linemen, offensive linemen, defensive linemen. Are those braces really a benefit, or are they, do they limit how the knee can turn, and can that lead to more problems?
Yeah, so the braces, especially after ACL injury, there's absolutely no data. I know Saquon wasn't wearing a brace and got a lot of questions about it. There's no data that braces help after ACL injuries. In fact, there's been a few quarterbacks who have worn them, and I think Tom Brady was one of them, and he slid, and the brace kind of got caught on him on when he was sliding after he ran. And he kind of was like, I'm over this. I'm not wearing this anymore because it can get caught in the turf and maybe cause another injury. As far as the linemen, the reason why they wear them is mostly to protect that MCL injuries. Linemen are kind of especially at risk for people falling on their legs, causing their knees to kind of buckle inwards and causing those MCL injuries. There's not a ton of data showing that it actually does prevent, but a lot of linemen like it. I know in college, almost everyone wears them, and then in the NFL, some wear, some don't. But that's what it's preventing. It doesn't really help with necessarily ACL injuries.
All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's Locked On Giants podcast. But first, if you are aiming to eat healthier, make sure you include Built Bar in your plan. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, but without the calories and without the sugar. Most Built Bars contain about 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein, making it easy to stick to any diet plan. Head on over to BuiltBar.com and use our special promo code LOCKED15 to save 15% off your first order. Again, that code is LOCKED15, LOCKED15, for 15% off your first order at BuiltBar.com. We're speaking with Dr. Eric Friedman. He is a sports medicine doctor. He works at Charleston Sports Medicine. You can find information about him in the show notes, as well as the link to the website if you want to check him out. If you're in the Charleston area, or if you're looking for a specialist, you can check him out. And Dr. Friedman, I want to ask you about some of the soft tissue injuries that the Giants have had. Specifically, they had a lot of calf injuries. And we hear, calf injury, and it's like, okay, what exactly is that? What's causing it? And why do they keep the guys out of practice for so long?
So the calf is a set of muscles that actually starts a little bit above the back of your knee and goes down and goes into the Achilles tendon into your foot. And it's made up of a few different muscles, mostly the gastrocnemius. If you ever hear one of the Giants doctors say something like that, that's the major. There's a medial, an inside one, and a lateral and outside part of that muscle. And that's the one that usually gets torn. There's also, I'm giving a little anatomy 101 for our Giants listeners, the soleus muscle, and then the plantaris muscle, which mostly don't get injured. And actually about 10% of people don't even have the plantaris muscle, so it doesn't do much. So it's mostly those gastrocnemius muscles. And the reason why, the theory on why they get injured so often is because they're at risk because they kind of cross two joints. So they cross that knee joint and the ankle joint. So it kind of the snapping sensation or whip sensation you can get when you have those calf injuries, and that's why. The reason why people hold them back from returning is because sometimes you'll feel pretty good walking on them and even jogging on them, but once you get into game situation and sprint, it's just a high risk of re-injury, and now you're set back to square one. So that's why we talk about those calf injuries and talk about the re-injury rate for those, which is extremely high.
Now, the Giants receivers in particular had to deal with a lot of hamstrings and calves and stuff like that. How much of that is the starting and stopping, going from 0 to 100 and then having to stop and then adjust along the way and not being able to consistently stay at a certain speed or sprint rate?
Yeah, I know Sterling Shepard's been dealing with a lot of them. I mean, if you have Sterling Shepard, most people don't do, even in their workouts, don't do a lot of sprinting and cutting, and it's just a different muscle that you need, and it's just a lot harder on your body. So that's exactly why. Offensive linemen don't do a ton of kind of full sprints and cuts. They'll do sprints, but obviously it's a little less quick cutting. And that's probably why you don't see as many soft tissue injuries with them, or just the avid runner who's just going on jogs. You don't see those because it's kind of the change in pace that can kind of stretch those muscles sometimes and cause them to tear.
And that same, I would assume, goes for hamstrings, which are, those things can linger. I mean, I've had hamstring injuries; those are painful. And again, so I mean, does it boil down to just stretching them out properly? What can be done to kind of minimize the risk here? Because in football, you're going to start and stop, and you're going to sprint and cut and do all this stuff. So what can be done to minimize some of these calf issues, some of these hamstring issues?
Yeah, we talked about mechanics, and then working with strength and conditioning coach and working on strengthening those muscles, especially returning from injury. The classic rule of thumb is you need to have at least 90% of your strength on the injured side as the other side. So for the hamstring, if once you get to that 90% on, let's say you had a right hamstring injury, once it's about 90% of the strength as the left one, that means you could probably return to play, and not sooner than that. And a lot of athletes, obviously, they want to play and they try to return sooner, and that just increases your risk of re-injury. And that's kind of the discussion between the coach, the GM, and the medical staff and the player, and kind of everyone getting together and saying, okay, this is the medical staff. Our job is to say, hey, this is the risk of re-injury. He's not ready yet. And then it's kind of the decision on everyone else, whether they're gonna play. Usually if the medical staff says they're 100% not ready and it'll risk their future lives, then that's kind of it. But there's other things like Joe Burrow in the Super Bowl. He had an MCL injury, and I think there is just a mic'd up where he's talking to the team doc and he says, I'm fine. And an MCL injury, it's painful, but your risk of re-injury is not devastating. So that's kind of a group effort and a group decision between everyone.
Now, medicine is constantly evolving every day, every week, every month, every year. I know one of the new methods, or I don't know how new it is, but they had platelet-rich therapy. I mean, what are some other things that maybe are emerging in sports medicine to help some of these players not only, prevent these injuries, but get back quicker?
Yeah, so one you mentioned is great, is PRP, or platelet-rich plasma. That's one that's kind of been studied for a little bit now, and a lot of the results are looking really good for especially soft tissue injury, tendon injuries. We use it at Charleston Sports Medicine for a lot of tendon injuries, even in your maybe not elite athletes, just who have chronic tendonitis, and it can help turn them around. Same thing with arthritis. We've been using PRP, and there's emerging data in the journals and everything showing peer-reviewed studies that are starting to show that, this PRP thing may actually work. I caution with a lot of the other things, especially early on. There's things like ultrasound therapy and laser therapy that a lot of teams do use, and it's not going to hurt anything when you have kind of enough money like the Giants and all NFL teams have in universities. You can try these things, and there's some data that shows it helps, but for kind of Joe Schmo out there, I don't know, depending on how much it costs, I don't know if I would be spending all the money on that. But there's some stem cell therapy that's also showing some promising literature as well. But a lot of these things are still kind of actively being studied. But like you said, PRP, I think, is starting to come a little bit more standard of care, especially for some of these soft tissue injuries in elite athletes, showing pretty good data about returning quickly. Usually they're not very open about telling us or the media or anyone who's actually getting these injections and who's not. But yeah, I think PRP is probably the best one.
At the end of the day, though, isn't it just better to let the body heal itself? I mean, I know sometimes it takes a little longer, especially as you get older, but at the end of the day, isn't that the best course of action?
Yes. I mean, obviously that has the most data behind it, as we've been doing it as humans for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it just kind of depends. Sometimes the body fails. So talking less about athletes and more about the general public, sometimes the body just is unable to heal itself. And that's how people get chronic tendinopathies, and the PRP and stuff like that can help with that. And then with athletes, I mean, it's millions and hundreds and thousands of dollars for every extra game they miss. So if there's an injection that can that can help them, they're all going to line up to take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all would like to have a magic pill to solve whatever's ailing us. And speaking of
Yeah.
pills, a lot of
Mhm.
athletes take supplements. Now, I know the NFL has a list of banned supplements they can't take, human growth hormones and stuff like that. But there's other stuff that I think are approved. And I won't even pretend to know the list, but I've seen, like, when we used to get into the locker room, we would see the stacks of, supplements and stuff like that. How much of that plays a factor in the body's response, do you think, to injuries, preventing injuries, to strength? Does it help? I mean, to me, it sounds like it's artificial stuff, and some of the stuff maybe you could be getting through your diet. So how much of a factor is that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. You're exactly right. Some of the stuff is stuff that you're already getting. I mean, these athletes are eating very well balanced meals, so they're getting most of what they need in their diet anyway. So some of these supplements are just expensive. You're just making expensive urine because your kidney does a very good job of saying, we already have enough of this vitamin, let's get rid of the rest of it. But there are some supplements, especially pre-workout stuff like creatine, that has pretty good data behind it and can help you work out for a little bit longer, a little bit more effective. But like you said, there's a lot of banned substances, and that's one of the hard part about supplements is it's very difficult for our government to be able to regulate it, because once it cracks down on one, they churn out 30 more. So you don't know exactly what's in there. And it used to be a big problem. I think now we see this less of, oh, I didn't know what was in there, because they know they're responsible for what they put in their body. So they're very careful about exactly who they're getting the supplements from and exactly what's in it. So that's one of the difficult parts about supplements.
Yeah, I've had trainers tell me stay away from them. Only take supplements that maybe the body can't produce, and that goes for vitamins as well. Like vitamin D is a big one. I can't go out in the sun, so I have to take vitamin D supplements by prescription. All right, so final question for you, Dr. Friedman.
Okay.
All right, there is no magic formula to build a program, I'm sure, that will prevent injuries. But that said, what are some best practices that a team can put into effect to help their athletes, whether it be in the weight room, whether it be how they practice, whether it be rest and recovery, diet, whatever it takes? What would you recommend if you were building a program from scratch for, say, my football team?
Yeah. So it's a multimodal program. It's getting your athletic trainer, your strength and conditioning coach, your head coach. I know at Duke, Coach Cutcliffe was great about stopping in and checking on the injured athletes and just helping with the mental side and reminding the athletes, hey, we're not forgetting about you. Keep working hard. You're doing great. It's a group of everything, and it's stretching. It's not just all lifting and things like that. It's yoga. It's working on those compound movements and making sure we're not just focusing on one thing. So that's kind of the general aspect. It's a multimodal thing. It's working on everything, mental aspect, the physical aspect, and making sure everyone's on the same page. The last thing you want is the strength and conditioning coach to say, hey, you need to do 3,000 bench press at 200 pounds, whatever. And then the athletic trainer is saying, no, we don't want you to do that. It's making sure communication, everyone's on the same team, and just trying to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep the athletes safe.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you along those lines, the Giants used to have lifts the day after playing a game, or like a couple days after. And I never understood the philosophy behind that, because if you're out there pushing around 300-pound guys and stuff like that, why wouldn't you give your body a chance to rest after that? Especially, and that happens also after a practice. They come in and they lift. And I don't understand the philosophy. You would think you'd want to rest and recover.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so you're a great point. There's a fine balance between kind of training and overtraining. So there's actually, in the sports medicine world, there's something called overtraining syndrome. And it's actually a diagnosis, which exactly what you're talking about, not giving enough rest. And then you actually see negative impact of working out and things like that. But I know there's some old school coaches who say, don't stop until you're starting to pee blood, but obviously that's kind of, those people have kind of been getting phased out of football, and you don't want that. So any listeners, if you start peeing blood, go see a doctor. But yeah, so there's a fine line, and the more we study this, the more sleep and rest and recovery is a huge part of it. One of my biggest pet peeves in either the media or when athletes talk about it is the the athlete was rehabbing like 24/7 or around the clock, and was working out around the clock to get back. And I hate that statement because it's actually, you need sleep, you need recovery, and it's a huge part of the rehab process. And it gives the wrong message and I'm sure these athletes are sleeping and recovering, but they put out there that they're doing it around the clock. And then you have all these younger athletes who look up to them who say, well, I don't want to rest. Saquon Barkley didn't say this, but Saquon Barkley said he was rehabbing around the clock and he got back. I want to do the same. Well, rest and recovery is a huge part of the rehab process.
And also keeping in mind that not everybody is the same.
Exactly. Yeah. Every patient is completely different. I mean, Saquon, obviously, his issue is not a strength issue, looking at his legs and quads. It may be more of a kind of activation issue or just bad luck. I mean, there's a lot of just bad luck. His was on a weird looking tackle. So it unfortunately, it's part of the game.
Definitely is. I'll tell you, it's a fascinating field, and I know a lot of Giant fans, and I know you're one, Dr. Friedman.
Yeah.
They why are they so injured? It's like every year they're up there leading the league, and you can point to training, you can point to the weather. When it gets colder out, the muscles maybe aren't as flexible or pliable. There's so many different facets to it, and I'll tell you what, the person who comes up with an answer is going to become a very rich person.
That's for sure. Yeah. If anyone has any ideas, I'm happy to listen.
Definitely. All right. Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for the insight, for coming on. This was great, very informative, and I'm sure the listeners are going to find this to be just as informative as I did. Basically, there's a lot of stuff to this, and we could probably do a whole, we could probably talk months about this topic, but some good core basic information. Giant fans, hope you enjoyed this. Again, you can find out more about Dr. Friedman. I'll put it in the show notes. You see his Twitter handle if you want to tweet out to him or follow him. He's always tweeting little things, especially in season, about injuries and stuff. So that'll do it for us here on the Locked On Giants podcast for the week. Thank you so much for tuning in, Giant fans. We'll be back on Monday with all new shows. For Dr. Friedman, I'm Patricia Traina. Have a great weekend, everybody.